Welcome to See Crime Stories, true stories of the missing and the pursuit of answers. New Canaan, Connecticut, a school day Friday in late May. A black SUV noses into a residential driveway, the garage door rolls down, and the neighborhood cameras have nothing more to give. A mother doesn't come back out. A day that should have been ordinary begins to fracture at the seams. Jennifer Farber-Dullos, 50, a writer and mother of 5, ran a precise routine. On May 24, 2019, she dropped the kids at school and returned to her home on Wells Lane at approximately 8:05 a.m. From that point forward, normal signals failed. Calendar reminders went unanswered. 2 appointments, one late morning, one early afternoon, were missed without explanation. Friends texted. A nanny checked in. By early evening, the concern was no longer casual, it was procedural. Officers who entered the residence found quiet rooms and a garage that did not match the rest of the house. It wasn't chaos. It was the opposite. Clean surfaces where they shouldn't have been clean. Patterns that looked like someone had wiped in a hurry and thought the job was finished. Forensics started at floor level and moved up, swabs, luminol, photographs, measured grids. The presence of blood was documented and preserved. It suggested a violent event had occurred in or at the threshold of that space. Inside the garage sat a Range Rover. Missing was a Chevy Suburban usually driven by Jennifer. The home itself offered no signs of a voluntary departure, no packed bag, no active planning, no documented ride share. Detectives widened the first ring of inquiry: school staff, neighbors, cameras facing the street, delivery routes, and sanitation schedules. They pulled DVRs before the systems overwrote themselves. They built a minute-by-minute window around the 8:05 a.m. return, looking for a vehicle that arrived, waited, or shadowed. They compared what was on camera with what wasn't and marked the gaps. Phone records and bank activity were flagged. Nothing moved after mid-morning, not a call placed, not a card swiped. In a case like this, absence becomes data. Late that evening, when a welfare check formalized the worry, the working theory shifted from missing to endangered missing. The garage guided that call. You don't need a body to see risk, you need the right patterns, the right amounts, the right context. No one in that house reported the event. No neighbor reported a struggle. In quiet suburbs, violence is often contained in moments shorter than a commercial break, and evidence depends on how quickly professionals arrive to preserve it. The first command decisions were straightforward: secure the residence, lock down vehicles associated with the household, and push outward along likely exit routes. The next decisions were strategic: map the most probable path for a removed body or evidence, and identify where that path might leave something behind, on a camera, in a store lot, or anywhere trash is collected and moved. In homicide work, the street grid matters. So do the garbage routes. Jennifer did not come home that night. The kids slept elsewhere. The house went dark behind police tape. What remained was a garage that said more than any witness could, and a timeline that would only get tighter as investigators layered in surveillance, digital pings, and the logistics of disposal. In towns like this, a disappearance doesn't just worry a neighborhood, it tests it. Welcome back to See Crime Stories, true stories of the missing and the pursuit of answers. In New Canaan, Connecticut, investigators started where the trail went cold, the house on Wells Lane, and the enclosed space where a morning routine ended at 8:05 a.m. The goal was simple and narrow: determine whether Jennifer Farber-Dullos left on her own or whether a violent event occurred inside the property. That answer would decide everything that followed. The garage became the primary scene because it was the last confirmed point where Jennifer's movements were documented. Detectives locked the door tracks, photographed the floor in grids, and preserved every swab and fiber. Nothing theatrical, just a sequence: secure, document, collect, compare. The rest of the house looked ordered, lived in, consistent with a parent who had just done a school drop-off. The garage did not. Wiping patterns showed up where they should not have been. It wasn't a bucket and mop job, it was a quick pass that missed the edges. Technicians noted where surfaces changed from clean to too clean, then tested those transitions. Positive results confirmed the working theory. An assault likely happened in or at the threshold of that room. From there, the team asked practical questions. If an attack occurred, how might a body or evidence have been moved? What vehicle was available, what vehicle was missing, and how fast could someone be off the property unseen from the street? Inside the garage sat a Range Rover. Absent was a Chevy Suburban that Jennifer typically used. That single discrepancy tightened the window. If the Suburban moved after the 8:05 a.m. return and never reappeared, the search had to account for where it went, where it could be staged, or whether it was used to carry a person and later abandoned or hidden. The second question was whether the scene supported survival. Investigators do not rely on guesswork for that. They measure, test, and compare to thresholds known from prior cases. The patterning, the amounts recovered, and the placement relative to the vehicle suggested an event incompatible with a voluntary departure. It did not require graphic detail to reach that conclusion. It required method and documentation. In cases without a body, scenes like this have to carry the weight that a medical examiner's report normally would. Here, the garage did the heavy lifting. Next came context. The house itself did not show signs of packing or planning. There were no tickets, no rideshare data, no money movement after mid-morning. That builds a negative space around the garage findings. Investigators also checked entry points. No windows jimmied. No obvious pry marks. In many suburbs, the most efficient path for an offender is not a window at midnight but a door when the neighborhood is at school or at work. Quiet seconds matter more than force. That idea shaped the canvas. Look for short-duration activity, arrive, wait, act, leave. Detectives moved outside the walls. Doorbell cameras can be decisive, but angles are limited. A lens can miss the inward side of a garage while catching the curb. So they worked outward, any camera with a view of Wells Lane, any commercial lot the Suburban might pass if it left, any public camera covering intersections in the first mile. This is where experience counts. In towns like this, routes to main roads funnel quickly. A vehicle leaving the property often has only a couple of efficient choices. The team mapped those options, flagged times that matched the house timeline, and made sure to pull and preserve footage before automatic overwrite cycles erased it. They also preserved the interior of the Range Rover. Even if it didn't move that day, interior trace can confirm whether someone tried to use it and then changed plans. It can also exclude it as a transport, which narrows focus to the missing Suburban. Detailing what a vehicle did not do is as important as proving what another vehicle did. The data aligned cleanly so far. Sometimes that was the problem. Clean lines can mean a plan, not a coincidence. While forensic work continued, a separate team handled the human piece, securing the children's safety, coordinating with friends, and communicating with family counsel. This isn't just procedure, it preserves attention for the evidence and prevents rumor from driving the narrative. In a disappearance, families need answers, but an investigation needs discipline. You can care about both at once. By the end of the first pass, detectives had enough to pivot the case classification. The garage findings supported endangered missing at minimum, and a likely homicide without a body as the more accurate frame. That shift is not about labels, it unlocks tools, wider search authority for vehicles, faster access to camera networks, and priority lab work. It also sets expectations with the public. A person did not simply walk away. A crime likely occurred, and the house told them so. There is a reason investigators start with rooms and radiate outward. Scenes don't argue, they record. When those records point in one direction, you follow. The next step would leave the driveway and follow the city's arteries, the places where trash is collected, where a vehicle might stop briefly, where a lens meant for traffic safety turns into a witness. If a body doesn't tell its story, the grid might. By mid-morning the house had been secured. The priority moved outside the walls, fix the day's clock, find the missing vehicle, and capture perishable video before automatic overwrites erased it. The working window started at 8:05 a.m., the time Jennifer Farber-Dullos was last documented returning home from the school run, and closed with the evening welfare check that pushed the case from concern to active search. Detectives split tasks. One team contacted the school and confirmed drop-off times, after which no additional in-person sightings occurred. Another team notified local clinics and the city hospital that 2 scheduled appointments were missed without cancellation. A third team began a camera canvass the way it's done in quiet suburbs, doorbells first, then any home CCTV facing Wells Lane, then businesses on feeder roads. They collected DVR units where homeowners consented and issued emergency preservation requests where consent wasn't immediately available. The goal wasn't to tell a story, it was to prevent the loss of data. The vehicle question drove the next move. Jennifer's Range Rover was in the garage. The Chevy Suburban she routinely used was not. Dispatch circulated the plate to patrol and parks. In the early evening, officers located the Suburban along Lapham Road near Waveny Park. The location mattered. Waveny is a large green space with trail networks, fields, and maintenance access, exactly the kind of area that demands immediate containment if there's any chance a person is injured nearby. The SUV was processed in place, photographed, and towed under seal. A K-9 sweep worked outward from the vehicle while officers knocked on doors facing the park perimeter to identify any midday activity that looked out of place. No credible live sightings developed. The phone records clock started next. Investigators sought call detail records and basic subscriber information, then drafted court orders for historical cell site location data. These aren't instant answers, they require judicial process, but early requests lock in the timeline and can be matched later against camera hits. Bank and card activity were also flagged. There were no transactions after mid-morning. That silence supported the same conclusion the garage suggested: this was not a voluntary break-in routine. On the tech side, officers queried town traffic cameras and any state-maintained feeds on routes leading away from Wells Lane and Waveny Park. They prioritized cameras with the highest chance of catching the Suburban's movements, then expanded to neighboring jurisdictions in case a driver left town quickly. License plate reader data were requested where available. Detectives mapped the most efficient paths between the residence, the park, and main corridors. In cases like this, you don't guess the route, you reduce the options to the few a driver would realistically choose when time matters. Sanitation became relevant before midnight. Supervisors verified the day's trash pickup schedules, the commercial routes, and which areas fed into city bins with frequent pickups. That sounds procedural because it is. When you have indications of violence at a home and a vehicle staged at a park, the next likely evidence stream is anything a suspect tried to discard in the hours that followed. Preserving those bins and identifying any cameras that cover them can make a no-body case possible. While those systems moved, detectives ran the human side without turning it into rumor. They confirmed where the children were and ensured they were safe. They checked with close friends who had heard nothing from Jennifer since morning. Officers handling the welfare check documented the home's condition and turned over findings to the forensic team already processing the garage. The message to the circle around the victim was clear: report anything that looks like planning or a sudden trip. Nothing credible surfaced. By the end of the first 24 hours, the case had real shape. Last known return at 8:05 a.m. evidence at the residence indicating a violent event. The family Suburban located at Waveny Park secured. No calls, no banking, no confirmed sightings after mid-morning. A broad video canvass underway, with traffic cameras and doorbells in the queue. Cell site and financial orders filed. Trash routes identified for preservation. The investigation wasn't relying on a single detail. It was building a net. People sometimes imagine a dramatic break in the first day. What usually happens is this: if you do the fundamentals quickly and in order, you don't need a miracle later. The garage told investigators where to start. The park showed where someone wanted attention to end. The city grid, the cameras, the phones, the logistics, would tell them where the day actually went. The tone within the command post reflected that. Calm. Focused. No one declared a conclusion. Everyone understood the clock. There is a human piece that doesn't make headlines but matters. Friends kept calling. The children slept away from the house that night. A detective made a simple note: "We will explain this to them better if we get the sequence right." That's not sentiment, it's purpose. In real cases, dignity is delivered by accuracy. The next steps were already assigned: expand the camera map outward from Waveny, lock down any footage along likely disposal routes, and match those timestamps to the movement of any vehicle associated with the household. If a person wanted to erase what happened in that garage, they had to move through public space to do it. Public space remembers. When a person vanishes, the first question the public asks is who, but investigators start with what was happening. Context isn't gossip, it sets stakes and explains why time matters. In the weeks before May 24, 2019, court records show Jennifer Farber-Dullos and her estranged husband were in a prolonged divorce and custody dispute involving their 5 children. Filings, motions, and scheduled hearings created a paper trail of a family under pressure. This isn't a judgment about anyone's character. It is a factual environment that explains why a missed appointment triggered more concern than usual and why friends escalated quickly when her phone stayed silent. Detectives pulled the family court docket the same day the welfare check was logged. They read the most recent orders, who had temporary custody, and the next hearing dates. They verified whether any protective provisions were in place about contact, exchanges, or restrictions. They noted who commonly transported the children, who handled school pickups, and which addresses were approved for overnights. That told them who had lawful access to the residence, who expected to see Jennifer that weekend, and where potential conflicts could surface. It also helped the team choose the right approach with the children's caretakers, protective but calm, because process can reduce harm in the middle of chaos. The next pass focused on communications connected to that legal backdrop. Investigators requested emails and texts between Jennifer and key parties in the days before the disappearance, attorneys, the guardian ad litem if appointed, and any court-related coordinators. They looked for references to meetings, handoffs, or arguments tied to the schedule. A dispute on paper doesn't prove a crime. But if a person disappears on a day with custody logistics in motion, timing isn't a footnote, it's a lead. The team filtered for messages that fixed times and places, who was supposed to be where, and when. On the financial side, the legal dispute often leaves a footprint. Detectives flagged any recent orders about accounts, housing, or support payments. They weren't auditing a marriage, they were looking for triggers, deadlines, late fees, or court-ordered transfers that might push activity into a narrow window. None of the transactions after mid-morning existed, which aligned with what the garage suggested. Jennifer did not continue her day. That absence, measured against a calendar full of obligations, strengthened the classification decision already made in the command post. The family context also guided outreach. Officers spoke with friends who knew the court routine, school parents who had covered pickups, neighbors who had seen exchanges in the driveway, anyone familiar with the schedule. The interviews stayed disciplined. Who last saw her? Did she express any change of plans? Was there an expected visit to or from the residence that morning? Emotional impressions can overwhelm a disappearance. The team kept questions practical. If something was scheduled at that house, it would appear in messages, and traffic near the residence, or on cameras along the expected route. There's a reason to keep this chapter narrow. Viewers often want a profile or a theory. Real cases move better with records than with speculation. Here, the record said, a mother embedded in an active court process did not show up for appointments, did not make contact, and did not move money after mid-morning. A dispute existed, but the investigation used it as a map, not a conclusion. Who had reason to be near the house? Who had knowledge of her routine? Who understood when the garage would be empty and when it wouldn't? Those questions pointed back to the same clock already built in chapters 1 through 3. The domestic file also mattered for one more reason: children. Investigators worked with family court counsel to ensure the kids were shielded from rumor and from accidental exposure to scene details. That coordination isn't soft, it's strategic. Children repeat what they hear. Keeping them safe protects their statements later and keeps the focus on evidence rather than on a swirl of fear. It also serves the baseline principle in no-body cases: dignity is accuracy, and accuracy needs clean lines. With the legal backdrop sketched in, the case didn't change categories, it gained direction. The paper trail gave dates and names that could be cross-checked against the camera canvas and phone record requests already moving. If a vehicle linked to the household stopped at a city bin miles away, that stop would have a timestamp. If that stop lined up with a gap in someone's explained schedule, it wouldn't be a story, it would be a match. The human story here is undeniable, but the way forward still ran through video and logistics. This is where a seasoned investigator keeps the tone steady. It's easy to overread a custody battle or to underplay it. The right approach is to log what's verified and then test each piece against movement in the real world: cars, roads, cameras, bins. Families navigating public courtrooms while privately breaking apart deserve truth more than theater. The balance we try to hold is simple: respect the people involved and pressure the facts. As the team closed out the day on the domestic review, one line stood out in the case notes: calendar control equals opportunity control. The schedule tells you when the house is likely empty, when a return is predictable, and when someone could time an approach to the minute. For investigators, that sentence isn't dramatic, it's a checklist item. Next, they would follow that logic to the places where the day left marks that don't forget: municipal corridors with reliable cameras and a stretch of road in Hartford where a series of trash bins would soon become central. The garage set the tone. The court file set the route. When a person vanishes, the first question the public asks is who, but investigators start with what was happening. Context isn't gossip, it sets stakes and explains why time matters. In the weeks before May 24, 2019, court records show Jennifer Farber-Dullos and her estranged husband were in a prolonged divorce and custody dispute involving their 5 children. Filings, motions, and scheduled hearings created a paper trail of a family under pressure. This isn't a judgment about anyone's character. It is a factual environment that explains why a missed appointment triggered more concern than usual and why friends escalated quickly when her phone stayed silent. Detectives pulled the family court docket the same day the welfare check was logged. They read the most recent orders, who had temporary custody, and the next hearing dates. They verified whether any protective provisions were in place about contact, exchanges, or restrictions. They noted who commonly transported the children, who handled school pickups, and which addresses were approved for overnights. That told them who had lawful access to the residence, who expected to see Jennifer that weekend, and where potential conflicts could surface. It also helped the team choose the right approach with the children's caretakers, protective but calm, because process can reduce harm in the middle of chaos. The next pass focused on communications connected to that legal backdrop. Investigators requested emails and texts between Jennifer and key parties in the days before the disappearance, attorneys, the guardian ad litem if appointed, and any court-related coordinators. They looked for references to meetings, handoffs, or arguments tied to the schedule. A dispute on paper doesn't prove a crime. But if a person disappears on a day with custody logistics in motion, timing isn't a footnote, it's a lead. The team filtered for messages that fixed times and places, who was supposed to be where, and when. On the financial side, the legal dispute often leaves a footprint. Detectives flagged any recent orders about accounts, housing, or support payments. They weren't auditing a marriage, they were looking for triggers, deadlines, late fees, or court-ordered transfers that might push activity into a narrow window. None of the transactions after mid-morning existed, which aligned with what the garage suggested. Jennifer did not continue her day. That absence, measured against a calendar full of obligations, strengthened the classification decision already made in the command post. The family context also guided outreach. Officers spoke with friends who knew the court routine, school parents who had covered pickups, neighbors who had seen exchanges in the driveway, anyone familiar with the schedule. The interviews stayed disciplined. Who last saw her? Did she express any change of plans? Was there an expected visit to or from the residence that morning? Emotional impressions can overwhelm a disappearance. The team kept questions practical. If something was scheduled at that house, it would appear in messages, in traffic near the residence, or on cameras along the expected route. There's a reason to keep this chapter narrow. Viewers often want a profile or a theory. Real cases move better with records than with speculation. Here, the record said, a mother embedded in an active court process did not show up for appointments, did not make contact, and did not move money after mid-morning. A dispute existed, but the investigation used it as a map, not a conclusion. Who had reason to be near the house? Who had knowledge of her routine? Who understood when the garage would be empty and when it wouldn't? Those questions pointed back to the same clock already built in chapters 1 through 3. The domestic file also mattered for one more reason: children. Investigators worked with family court counsel to ensure the kids were shielded from rumor and from accidental exposure to scene details. That coordination isn't soft, it's strategic. Children repeat what they hear. Keeping them safe protects their statements later and keeps the focus on evidence rather than on a swirl of fear. It also serves the baseline principle in no-body cases: dignity is accuracy, and accuracy needs clean lines. With the legal backdrop sketched in, the case didn't change categories, it gained direction. The paper trail gave dates and names that could be cross-checked against the camera canvas and phone record requests already moving. If a vehicle linked to the household stopped at a city bin miles away, that stop would have a timestamp. If that stop lined up with a gap in someone's explained schedule, it wouldn't be a story, it would be a match. The human story here is undeniable, but the way forward still ran through video and logistics. This is where a seasoned investigator keeps the tone steady. It's easy to overread a custody battle or to underplay it. The right approach is to log what's verified and then test each piece against movement in the real world: cars, roads, cameras, bins. Families navigating public courtrooms while privately breaking apart deserve truth more than theater. The balance we try to hold is simple: respect the people involved and pressure the facts. As the team closed out the day on the domestic review, one line stood out in the case notes: calendar control equals opportunity control. The schedule tells you when the house is likely empty, when a return is predictable, and when someone could time an approach to the minute. For investigators, that sentence isn't dramatic, it's a checklist item. Next, they would follow that logic to the places where the day left marks that don't forget: municipal corridors with reliable cameras and a stretch of road in Hartford where a series of trash bins would soon become central. The garage set the tone. The court file set the route. By the time the first weekend arrived, the search grid had a shape: the house, the park, and a set of likely corridors that connect New Canaan to Hartford. The choice to expand into the city wasn't guesswork. Detectives compared traffic patterns with the timeline they had already locked in and looked for places where a driver could get lost in volume: bigger roads, more lanes, and cameras that roll all day for public safety. They asked a simple question: if evidence left the house, where would it surface first? Hartford's Albany Avenue became the answer because cameras there do not depend on luck. Investigators traced a vehicle moving along the corridor in the evening hours and watched the pauses. It wasn't a steady cruise. It was a rhythm: slow to a stop near a curbside bin, move, stop again a few blocks later, move again. Each pause lined up with a public trash container. That pattern mattered more than the make or color of the truck. Patterns are harder to stage than appearances. The team pulled the relevant clips and timestamps and preserved them before daily overwrites did their work. Collection was straightforward. Officers coordinated with the city's sanitation crews to isolate the bins that matched the stops and to control the downstream path so nothing got crushed or mixed beyond recovery. No dramatics. Gloves, paper bags, and inventory forms. They opened the first bin and found a black bag with clothing inside. A few blocks away, another bag with more items: a cut length of tape, a sponge, a poncho that had no reason to be there on a clear day. Piece by piece, the contents began to look like post-event cleanup rather than routine household trash. That's a hard phrase, but it's accurate. The sequence of disposals, the spacing of the stops, and the type of items told a single story. Back in the lab, preliminary tests did what they always do in cases like this: screen first, confirm second. The screens suggested the presence of blood on select items. Confirmations matched to a known profile tied to the missing person. It is one thing to suspect a violent event at a residence. It is another to find a city bin that contains clothing cut away, materials consistent with cleanup, and biological traces of the person who never returned home. The legal posture of the case adjusted with each report. Missing had already shifted to endangered. Now homicide without a body moved from a theory to a working classification backed by evidence that would hold up under cross-examination. Detectives reviewed the Albany Avenue video again, this time against any vehicle linked to the people in Jennifer's orbit. They didn't need dialogue, they needed a clock. Each stop had a time. Each pull away had a direction. The map of those stops created a spine for the case narrative that did not rely on memory or opinion. If you play it through, the route becomes a checklist: this bin, that corner, this camera, that alley. The team returned to a handful of sites to ensure they had not missed satellite containers or private cameras that captured the truck from a better angle. In investigations, second passes are not overkill. They are insurance. One reason the trash bag trail is powerful in a nobody case is that it creates physical anchors. A house can be cleaned, and a vehicle can be wiped down, but a city's trash moves on a clock that does not care who anyone is. If you intervene before the transfer to a compactor or a landfill, you can freeze that clock and listen to what it says. Here, it said that someone drove a route with pre-planned pauses and offloaded items that do not appear in household trash by accident. It said those items carried the one thing a courtroom trusts when witnesses are gone: the victim's own biological record. There's a human dimension to this that matters, even when you keep the tone businesslike. Families hope their missing person will walk in the door. Detectives hope the evidence will talk first. These goals are not opposed, they are different paths to the same point: truth the family can live with. When a lab report confirms a match, the room gets quiet. People think about children, about what the next conversation will be, about how to balance speed with precision. In our work, dignity comes from being certain before we speak. The Albany Avenue sequence also widened the field for follow-up. If a driver disposed of items in that corridor, they likely passed commercial lots, ATMs, and service stations with cameras angled at entrances and exits. Investigators pulled additional feeds from those businesses and compared the vehicle's silhouette, bed length, lights, any distinctive mapping, to verify whether the same truck reappeared on adjacent streets at times that fit the pattern. Even small details, like how a bumper sits in relation to a curb, can distinguish one vehicle from another when frames are grainy. The standard is not maybe. The standard is provable. As the surveillance collection closed, the trash bag evidence did two things at once. It connected the residents to a public corridor, and it gave prosecutors something that jurors could hold in their hands: photos, logs, inventories, and lab reports that, together, built a spine strong enough to carry the weight of a case without a recovered body. That does not end a search. It redirects it. If items traveled this route, a driver made choices about time and distance, about where to stop and where not to. Those choices can point investigators to locations worth searching again: edges of lots, drainage areas, places where someone might ditch tools or clothing when a bin is full. You can feel the shift in an investigation when a pattern like this locks in. The team stops talking about whether something happened and starts charting who had both the reason and the opportunity to make it look like nothing did. That's not theory. That's the practical math of time, route, and disposal. The Albany Avenue recoveries changed the posture of the case. The lab reports changed its weight. You can doubt what a camera seems to show. You don't argue with what a profile matches. Each item from the Hartford bins went through the same path: photographed, logged, screened, then confirmed. The confirmations came back in a language jurors understand: short tandem repeat DNA profiles consistent with one individual, Jennifer Farber-Dullos. Where the clothing was cut, where adhesive met fabric, and where a sponge had been used, biological traces survived. Even with environmental exposure, the signatures held. Inside the residence, the scene team had already built a map of where blood existed and where someone tried to remove it. The lab compared that interior map to the stains and transfer on the recovered items. The alignment mattered. It wasn't just there is blood at both places. It was, the same person's DNA appears in the home and on materials consistent with post-event cleanup that were discarded along a timed urban route. The chain of custody was tight, the statistics attached to the DNA calls were high, the match points met accepted thresholds. In homicide work without a body, this is how a case moves from suspicion to proof. The next question was survivability. Medical examiners and forensic pathologists don't guess at outcomes, they examine amounts, patterns, and locations. The interior findings indicated more than incidental injury. Combined with the absence of any medical contact, pharmacy fills, or hospital intake after mid-morning on May 24th, the opinion was direct. The injuries indicated by the scene and the recovered items were not consistent with someone walking away and resuming life. That conclusion did not depend on vivid description. It depended on the volume and placement of biological material and the absence of any recovery behavior in the hours that followed. The materials from the bins had their own story beyond DNA. A section of tape retained touch-level cells sufficient to associate handling. The poncho, out of place on a clear day, carried traces in a way that made practical sense if someone used it to shield clothing during a cleanup. A cut garment presented edges that suggested scissors rather than tearing, consistent with a quick effort to remove problem areas rather than launder them. None of this is dramatic. It is ordinary behavior after a violent event, documented item by item, then anchored to a clock by surveillance. Digitally, the lab work let investigators reinterrogate the timeline with more confidence. The clock at the house, the staging of a vehicle at the park, and the bin sequence in Hartford now formed a single spine. The intervals between stops on Albany Avenue were short. Whoever drove that route had pre-selected locations or was following a plan made in advance. When evidence behaves like this, wiped, cut, bagged, separated, and dumped in a pattern, you don't expect a voluntary disappearance to be the alternative explanation. You expect a prosecutor to stand in front of a jury with photos, logs, and lab reports and explain why a body isn't required to prove death. There is a human line running through this, and it is simple. Families want certainty. Certainty in a nobody case rarely arrives as a single moment. It arrives as the sum of consistent parts that all point the same way. The science here did that. It respected the victim by refusing to speculate and by insisting that each conclusion be earned. When you speak to children later, when they ask how you know, you can say, because the evidence matched in the house and miles away, because the city's clock and the lab's numbers agreed, and because there was no sign of life when there should have been many. Back in the command post, the classification locked. The case would be worked and presented as homicide without a recovered body. That decision unlocked further warrants, prioritized additional lab cues, and set the stage for the next investigative layer, phones, pings, and movements that could correlate a specific person's day to the city's trash bin trail. For now, the science had done what it could do, replaced doubt with structure. The science put structure on the case, the devices put names to the structure. Investigators served carriers for call detail records and historical cell site location information tied to key phones in the circle around Jennifer Farber-Dulos. The requests were targeted and time-bounded, from the school drop-off window through late night the same day, and then the following 24 hours. They weren't fishing. They were testing whether any device traveled the same spine the evidence had already drawn: house, park, Hartford corridor. The first layer was simple traffic, calls placed, texts sent, and periods of silence. Jennifer's line went quiet after mid-morning, consistent with what we already know. What mattered now was movement by others. Cell site returns showed a device associated with a primary person of interest leaving Farmington and moving south toward New Canaan early that morning, then later appearing in patterns consistent with a route into Hartford that evening. Another device, linked to someone close to that same person, produced hits that matched the Albany Avenue sequence in the hour the trash bin stops occurred. The point wasn't just that phones were in the area. The point was clock alignment, towers, sectors, and timestamps matching camera pauses within minutes. Cameras added confirmation where radio waves can blur. Along the morning path into New Canaan, a red pickup linked to an associate appeared on residential surveillance near the victim's street. The truck's movements fit the return window we established in the first chapters. That afternoon and evening, city cameras on Albany Avenue recorded a pickup stopping at multiple curbside bins. Frame quality varied, but the silhouette, lighting pattern, and bed profile were consistent across stops. When you lay the frames against cell site hits, stop, move, stop, the route becomes more than suggestive. It becomes a timeline with two independent witnesses, the tower map in the lens. Investigators pressed the vehicle angle harder because trucks carry trace. Maintenance records, car wash receipts, and service bay logs were pulled for the relevant dates. One report noted a fast interior clean and seat work out of sequence with normal service intervals. That is the kind of entry that looks ordinary until you place it next to a city's trash bin trail and a lab match to a missing person. The team documented it, preserved any available shop surveillance, and interviewed staff with a single question: what exactly was done, and when? Digital housekeeping also came under review. Deletions, factory resets, and app removals around the windows that matter are not conclusions by themselves, but they change the weight of other facts. Here, periods of device silence lined up too neatly with physical errands we already knew happened. A prosecutor does not need to prove why a phone went dark. They need to show what happened while it was dark. All of this moves a no-body case toward court in a way jurors can follow. You do not ask them to imagine what might have happened in a garage. You show them a morning approach on a quiet street, a vehicle staged at a park, an evening disposal route in a city, and phones that ride along on the same clock. You add one sentence that matters to families: the truth is built, not guessed. Interviews only matter if the timeline is already built. By the time detectives sat down across those tables, the spying was fixed, the morning return to New Canaan at 8:05, the suburban staged at Waveny Park, the Albany Avenue trash bin sequence, and lab confirmations that tied discarded items to Jennifer Faber-Dulos. The questions were narrow: explain this hour, this stop, this errand. Initial statements covered routines, wait times, trips, messages. When plotted against carrier returns and cameras, gaps appeared. A claimed location fell outside the sector of the tower that logged the device. An at-home evening overlapped with curbside pauses already preserved on Hartford's corridor. Confrontations weren't needed, a single timestamp did the work. Explanations shifted, a vague errand became a different route, not Hartford became drove through. Each change was documented beside the first version. In court, movement toward the evidence speaks louder than a denial. Vehicles filled in what words could not. Service and car wash records showed interior work out of sequence, seat attention and fast cleaning flagged within hours of the Albany stops. Staff placed the truck in a bay, shop video confirmed the time. Private cameras a few blocks off Albany captured the same silhouette and bedline scene on city feeds, matching the stop-and-go rhythm within minutes. You don't need perfect plates when the route, shape, and clock align. Towers don't care who you are, DVRs don't either. Together, they corroborate. Digital housekeeping was reviewed without drama. Short windows of device silence paralleled the disposal run. App removals and resets near key times didn't prove intent, they changed the weight of everything else. Prosecutors don't need to explain why a phone went dark, only what happened while it was dark. Here, the answer was a route with pre-planned pauses and bags that carried the victim's biological record miles from home. Detectives returned to the interview rooms with one still frame and one receipt at a time. The goal was not to corner anyone, it was to test survivability of a story against a fixed clock. The clock won. None of this required speculation about motive or personality. It required the discipline to keep the case inside a lane, violence indicated in the residence, staging at a park, disposal along an urban corridor, DNA that tied the bins back to the home, devices and a truck that traveled the same path. Families ask what certainty looks like when there is no body. In this case, it looked like a day that stopped at 8:05 and never restarted, like a vehicle that waited in a lot without its driver, like a city's trash schedule that became the witness no person could be, and like science that refused to guess. Accuracy is a form of respect. It's how you answer children later, by showing them the sequence, not by telling them a theory. The public record closes with one ending. In January 2020, the man charged in Jennifer's disappearance was arrested and later died following a suicide attempt before trial. In 2023, a court declared Jennifer legally deceased. Her remains have not been found. In 2024, a co-defendant was convicted on evidence tampering and related counts and sentenced to 14.5 years. In 2025, another defendant resolved a related charge by plea. The investigation remains open where it must, searching for Jennifer, while the legal outcomes reflect the burden met in a nobody homicide, a house that spoke, a route that held, and labs that matched. We end where the case began, with a quiet morning and a clock. What carried this case was not a confession or a recovered body, but a sequence that never broke. That is the standard worth insisting on, in Connecticut, and anywhere a missing person deserves the truth. I'll leave you with this: truth isn't loud, it's consistent. In a nobody case, calendars, cameras, and small choices tell the story you can't see. If you're in a hard season, document everything, lean on people who show up, and report early. Safety isn't overreacting, it's prevention. What part of this case struck you most? The timeline, the bin trail, or the device data? Do you think your town would preserve evidence this well? Share your take and where you're watching from. If this reached you, or even if it didn't, tell me why. And if you value work like this, please subscribe to see crime stories for what's next.